Welcome to part 2 of the build series for the mech that I'm creating for the original Mecha contest. If you haven't seen the first part of my video series, I'm creating a demon mech, and so the idea with this one is that it's the creation of an AI that's been charged with recreating a lost civilization. In doing so, the AI hasn't realised that some of the stories it's been reading are myths, and so it's trying to recreate something from a myth. So the idea is that this is a robotic demon, and it's going to have a lot of fire and sort of hot elements that are coming from an overreactive reactor. Kind of think like a cyber Balrog from Lord of the Rings. So that's the idea, and as you can probably see if you have seen the first part, that we've come quite a way since that point. So it's now got a head and some hands, and I've also added a lot of mechanical detailing to the piece. So in this video we're going to be going through the creation of all of this mechanical detail. Now in the first part of the video I started making a piston that would go on the back of the leg. And this was the first time using the milling setup that I've created here. Now I put something together, but I started thinking, you know, this isn't actually that great. I think I need to push myself a little bit more with this, so I started thinking that I should actually make something a bit more elaborate for the back of the legs. So I decided to have another go at this. And as you can see, I'm using the mill and the lathe to create a slightly more elaborate setup here. So I've come up with this for the back of the leg, and I've got this sort of cover that goes over the front of the piston, so what I'm going to do is cut in some additional mechanical detailing on the mill. What I've also made are these ball and socket joints, so these are going to go on the end of the piston, and because they're a ball and socket that means they can move in any orientation, so if the robot flexes its ankle or rocks back and forth, the ball and sockets will be able to move with that motion. I've also made some additional ball and socket joints for these pistons as well, and these are going to be going on the waist of the robot, so again if the robot twists it can move in any orientation, and the ball joints will allow that to happen. So I need at least 2 of these, so I'm going to take all the individual pieces and make moulds. And because the piston's quite a long piece, I need to actually cut the mould in order to get this out. So I'm just being quite careful to cut along the air channels that I've put into the mould. And as you can see here in this close-up, I'm cutting the silicone that's formed between the pipes of the piston. So you just got to be a little bit careful with this. It's sort of like delicate surgery really, but if you move slowly, you can cut through that relatively easily. And jumping ahead in time, here's some casts from my mould. So there's my cast of the piston, so all I really need to do here is just cut away the air channels that I've put in there and get rid of the flashing. So it doesn't take much cleanup to get a piece that I can use. And actually in doing this I realised I hadn't made a mould of this square piece, so I'm just going to quickly go and make one of that as well. Sort of see how that's going to fit on the back there. Now what I originally had on the back of the leg was this hinge, but of course if you have a hinge it can only move in one plane, whereas if you have a ball joint it can move in any plane. So I need to get rid of this hinge so I can have a slightly more sensible piston on the back there. So yeah, the hinge didn't really make a lot of sense, I just wasn't really thinking it through, so I can get rid of that and put this in its place. So hopefully you can see how that's going to fit. The previous piece that I made didn't go to waste, I simply decided to add it to the base of the pelvis here as well. Not quite sure what it's going to do, but it's just some interesting mechanical detailing. So I'm now turning my attention to the feet as well, and at the minute I've just got these basic shapes in place with a plan to sort of embellish these a bit further. And looking at this I started thinking, well maybe I can use some of the shapes that I've already got. And because I've used sort of similar diameter pipes in a lot of these pieces, this piston that I made for the waist will actually fit exactly inside this piece as well. So putting those two bits together I started thinking, well actually that kind of looks like a toe. It's got a ball joint that I can use, and it's got a decent shaped piece for a sort of a carapace on the foot. So I think that's going to look quite good. So I've just been shaping these pieces down with a Dremel, and with the socket on the front of the foot that fits in quite well. Now I think I need to shape the front of the toe a little bit just to change that, but I think that's going to look pretty good. Now, the good thing with the resin is it's actually relatively soft, so it's very easy to shape with a Dremel. Right, so there you go, so we're now getting some fairly decent looking feet shapes in place, so I'm quite liking the look of that. So something else that I started thinking about was the fact that the ankle can't move left and right. It can move back and forward, but it can't move left and right, and obviously that's going to be a bit of a problem if this thing's walking about. I had originally thought maybe it could just reposition its toes to get around that, but I think it's going to look more sensible if it actually has some means of moving its foot in that way. So what I'm going to do is take the foot apart and add a cylinder facing back and forward, that way it can then rock left and right if it needs to. I quite like the sort of natural way the leg moves there, it looks kind of cool. Now, this was a little bit tricky to put back together, but there's the finished result. So you can now see that the robot could in principle rock its leg back and forth if it needs to. So I started thinking about making some more mechanical detailing for the piece, and what I've done is to create this, and this is effectively a sprue of canisters of various sizes. I always think canisters look quite cool in sort of mechanical detailing, sort of implies there's some gas flowing through the system. So I've made these in a variety of sizes so I can sort of mix and match as I need. So what I'm going to do is make a mould of this, and then I can pour in some resin and reproduce as many of these as I need. I'm also taking the opportunity to make a mould of some other pieces as well. The black pieces are actually some fittings that came with some IKEA furniture. I hung on to them ages ago thinking they'd be useful, so now's the time to make a mould of those so I can use as many as I need. The brass bits are some pieces that I made a while back for a separate project. So I'm just going to pour some silicone over all of these, and once that's dry I can then cut them open and get casting. Now with the canisters, it's sort of the same as the piston that I did earlier. I just need to slowly cut this away so I can get the pieces out of the mould. Right, so there we go, so there's one empty mould. And jumping ahead, I've poured in some resin, so there's my sprue. It's come apart a bit as I've taken it out. I don't know if you can see in this shot, but the smaller of the canisters is only half filled when I've poured the resin in. Now remember that, because that becomes a little bit significant a bit later on. I actually fixed that in this pour by just cutting the mould slightly to create a slightly thicker channel. As you can see in this pour, the smaller canisters come out just fine, and that's just because I created a larger channel in the mould. But this started me thinking about how I could go about making the hands for the piece, so I'll come back to this in a sec. And I'm just gluing some casts from my canisters onto the leg here to create some additional mechanical detailing. I'm figuring these things can feed maybe hydraulic pressure to the pistons, something like that, so it just makes sense for them to be near a large piston, I think. Right, so I'm now starting to think about doing the hands for the robots. And as it happens, the robot I'm making is more or less a similar size to the four-armed android that I made in a previous video. So I've just taken off one of the hands so I can sort of use this as a reference. I think I had originally intended to actually do a similar setup for the hands for this robot, but as it turned out, they went in a very different direction. Because this is a demon, I wanted something a bit more claw-like, so I've done something a little bit different for this. So what I've done is to cut up some pieces of acrylic and styrene tube to make a finger. And the idea of this is I'm going to make moulds of all of these pieces so I can reproduce multiple fingers. So I'm just going to blue tack these together so you can sort of see what this is going to look like. So there you go, so as you can see it's a fairly complicated piece. So I needed to start thinking about how exactly I was going to mould this. If you've seen some of my previous videos, you'll know about pressure casting. So what you do is you pour your resin into your mould, put it in a pressure pot, increase the pressure, and what that does is it crunches all of the bubbles down to tiny dots so that you don't get any air bubbles in your casts. Now I could have done this for this, to be honest with you I was probably being a little bit lazy. For something so small it's a bit of a faff to sort of get the pressure chamber out, pressurise the compressor, all of that stuff, so I wanted something I could just do very quickly on the desktop. So what I've done is again make a sprue, so I've got channels to allow the resin in and the air out, as you can see. And what I've got is this large canister on the side. Now what I've basically done here is to make an injection mould. So to demonstrate how this is going to work, I'm going to pour some resin into the cavity where that large bar is. I'm then going to push the bar into the mould like this. What that's going to do is force the resin through the mould and back up out of the air channels. Now, I don't really know if this is going to work, but in principle it should. Injection moulding is generally used with high temperature plastic, so it's not something you could really do in a sort of a domestic workshop. But I think this might work quite well for resin, so we're going to give it a go and see how it works out. So as before, I'm pouring some silicone over my piece and leaving that to dry overnight. So that's now dry, so I can now do the same procedure as before, cut open the mould and free the pieces. So again, this is quite a slow process, there's quite a lot of detail in this, so it took quite a while to cut this free, but got there in the end. Right, so I've mixed up some resin, so here we go, I'm going to pour that into the cavity. And then pressing down with the plunger forces the resin through the mould. Well, so there we go, so there's a cast from the mould. I have to say I'm really surprised at how well this has come out. There are a few air bubbles around some of the edges, but generally speaking it's come out really well, so that bodes well. So what I can now do is go ahead and produce 10 fingers, and that makes things fairly easy. Obviously hands are always a bit tricky because there's so many individual pieces to them, so I do tend to dread doing them, but this has made things quite easy, so I'm really pleased with that. Right, so I can now cut all the individual pieces off and assemble this into a finger. Obviously it takes a little bit of clear up to clean away the sprues, but to be honest with you it's fairly similar to working like a Games Workshop model or any other model kit. Right, so there's the pieces all glued together and that's one finger. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and create some more. Obviously it's got this big talon on the end, so I might sort of file that down a little bit for some of the other fingers, just to sort of vary their length a bit, because obviously fingers aren't all the same length. So there's a bunch more sprues, so I can now go ahead and create all the fingers that I need. So here's the beginning of a hand. I've just sort of blue tacked these pieces in place to get an idea of how this will look. I think it's looking pretty cool. Now obviously I need to attach a thumb as well, and I've just glued this onto another cast resin piece. I think it's looking pretty cool. So I now need to start thinking about a forearm to attach the hand to. So what I've done is to take one of the cylinders that I cast up earlier, and I'm using the mill to cut in some channels. I'm not really sure what I'm doing here, I'm just trying to come up with something that looks cool and that could function as a forearm. So skip forward a little bit, and I've just gone a bit crazy here and cut a load of different channels into this piece, and I've also put it on the lathe to give a bit more detail around the edges as well. I think that's looking pretty cool. It looks like a manufactured item of some sort, so I think that's going to serve pretty well as a forearm. And there's the hand just pinned in place, so I think that's looking okay. There's quite a lot of degrees of freedom to that as well, which is quite nice. Now obviously I've got this large channel down the centre of the forearm, so I was thinking that this could contain a piston of some sort. So I've got some styrene tube here and a piece of aluminium bar, and I've put those together to create a piston. Now I was sort of thinking maybe I should just glue this in place, but I think it would be quite fun if this could actually move. The piece is quite mobile, so I think that should work pretty well. So I'm going to create some additional hinges on this, and then the piston should be able to move in relation to the hand's motion. Cool, so there you go, so that was pretty cool. I think some of you may have seen this on Instagram previously, but yeah, I like the degree of motion that's got. So it's always nice to have a degree of posability in any model, so I think it's quite nice. I can move the arms to some extent and obviously get some sympathetic motion from the piston as well, so it's looking pretty cool. So I'm now turning my attention to the head of the robot, and I've got a basic idea of how this looks. I mean, obviously I've said before I'm using the picture of the Balrog as a vague idea of what this can look like. I don't want to totally copy it though, so I'm sort of going for a sort of a demonic creature of some sort. I do want it to have some horns, and I'm thinking that some cabling could be used to sort of give the impression of horns. So with that in mind, what I'm doing is using these casts that I made earlier. These are from some IKEA furniture I think, but they're quite nice little connectors, and this conduit fits quite nicely inside. So this is going to be a nice way of attaching the conduit to the robot itself. I don't know how easily you can see in this shot there, but that's going to fit on the globe there and then feed down to the head. So I've got a basic idea of how this is going to look. So what I've done is to glue a few pieces together, and as you can see I'm thinking that this curved piece of conduit here could give the impression of some horns. I'm thinking this can feed down to a gun, so there'll actually be like a real world purpose for it. It's feeding power to this gun, but of course it's really there just to look like a curly sort of a goat's horn. So that's the idea there. So I'm just going to keep adding pieces to this to try and build up a shape that I like the look of. So I've added some sort of bars here to hold the horns in place, and I'll be adding some guns to the ends of those at a later point. So hopefully you can see the beginnings of how that's going to look, and it's really just a question of adding shapes to this. And I have to admit I went back and forth on this quite a lot. Getting the right look to it is quite important, so obviously you want it to look fierce and it's kind of going to be a focal point for the model. So I spent quite a lot of time trying to get it to look fierce and not dopey. And it's difficult to envisage because it's not painted yet, because I haven't put any LEDs in it yet. It's a bit difficult to get an idea of how the final version is going to look. Sort of hoping that I can put it together at the end of this, but we'll see how we go. Now, something that I have to confess I've stolen directly from Horizon Zero Dawn is this idea. I want to have some chainsaws in the mouth. I think it's a cool way of having teeth in a robot without sort of deliberately having teeth, if you see what I mean. So having some chainsaws in the mouth might imply that perhaps there's a use for the head other than looking scary. Maybe it's repurposed some machinery that was previously used for logging trees, something like that. I mean, who knows? My idea with this is that the AI that's created it is sort of using stuff that it's got to hand. So I doubt there would be a dedicated demon creating factories in the world that this is happening in, but there might be some automated factories that used to produce industrial machinery or tractors or something like that. So I can imagine a situation where the AI may repurpose those factories to create this demon robot, but it's sort of constrained by what it's got. So it hasn't got like a demon press in the factory, but it has got some machinery that can create chainsaws, for example, and it's got machinery that can create pistons. So it's just using those existing technologies it's got to create this robot. So with that in mind, I started thinking, well, what could I use to add some convincing saw teeth to this robot? And looking about the workshop, I thought, oh well, I could use a saw, couldn't I? So this coping saw blade has been sacrificed to create these sort of chainsaw shapes, and I'm just cutting the blade into small sections so I can put it around the curve here. So I think that's looking okay. These jaws I've created on the mill. I've cut out some shapes in acrylic. Then I've just used the mill to cut some additional mechanical detailing. As I mentioned, I went back and forth quite a bit on the head, and what I've actually done here is to actually add some monster clay on top of it. That's just to help me envisage how this should look. It was looking a bit dopey for quite a while, so I felt that it needed some sort of additional shapes to make it look a bit meaner. And this is sort of my just rough sketch effectively to try and see how that could look. I haven't actually put the furrowed brow on the current piece at the minute, but that's something I do plan to add. So as I mentioned, I want to have some guns on the side of the head, so I'm just using some brass tube to do that, and more of these cast pieces I use for the legs and feet. The brass rod's exactly the same diameter as the rod I use for the piston, so that fits on quite nicely. One thing that I knew I wanted to have from the beginning of this project was some canisters on the back of the robot. Now this is something I've done for previous mech models. I think it looks quite cool. I'm quite sure why, but just something about having those things protruding from the back. I guess it's a little bit like H.R. Giger's Alien. Sort of makes me think of that a little bit, I suppose. But what I wanted to do in this case is to have a canister with a lot of detail on it. Pressure canisters are often just like a single sort of shape really, and so I wanted to add as much detail to this as I possibly could, just to sort of do the complete opposite of some of the other canisters I've featured on the model so far. So as you can see, I've come up with this piece here, and this is just a bunch of lathed shapes and styrene pieces I've sort of added together. And what I plan to do is, as with everything, make a mould of this so I can cast up multiple copies. So it's the same process as you've seen a million times. Make a little box around it and pour in some silicone. Now, although I've said I hate pressure casting in the earlier part of this video, this is one shape that I knew I would have to. There's so much detail in it, there's no way I'd be able to pour these without getting air bubbles trapped inside. Skipping ahead, here's my first cast, and as you can see that's looking pretty cool. So I'm going to do another one of those and add them to the back of the robot. Right, so there we go. So I think that's it for this piece. Now, obviously I've done quite a lot in this video, but there's still plenty to do. And now that I've got most of the mechanical detailing done on the interior of the model, I've now got to start thinking about what its skin will look like. And obviously there's a bit of a toss-up there. How much of this detail do I cover with armour plating? How much do I leave bare? You know, it's sort of an aesthetic decision really, but that's something I'll have to look at in the next part of the video. So if you've stuck with it this far, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.